Good evening. The July 6th, 2022 Board of Education Special Work Session for the Cedar Rapids Community School District is called to order. I'd like to note that Director Borcherding and Superintendent Bush are joining via Zoom this evening. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move that the agenda of Wednesday, July 6, 2022 Board of Education Special Work Session be approved as set forth, and that each item is considered ready for discussion and/or action.
Is there a second?
Second.
This is a roll call vote.
Director Roundtree.
Aye.
Director Marshbach.
Aye.
Director Newman.
Aye.
Director Humbles.
Aye.
Director Garlock.
Aye.
Director Borcherding.
Aye.
And President Tominski.
Aye. Tonight's work session is provided at the board's request to further discuss the SRO program in collaboration with the City of Cedar Rapids. The board agenda includes a lot of detailed information, including responses to questions that were provided by some of the board members. We've set aside approximately 90 minutes to discuss the information that has been provided by the administration. Superintendent Bush and Deputy Superintendent Quaker are joining us tonight and available to clarify any responses as part of our discussion. After our last board meeting, there was a motion to table the vote on the 28E agreement, the SRO program. That motion passed, and so we're here tonight. I think shortly after that board meeting, Superintendent Bush sent out an email to all board members asking if there was any questions that we wanted clarification to, open questions that we had remaining, so that we had enough information so that we could vote on that. And I think it was discussed then that the vote would come back up at our next board meeting, which is this coming Monday. Deputy Superintendent Quaker, you took the lead for the district, and I think there was 35 questions from what I saw from the exhibit. The collection of us, all of the board members together, had about 35 questions. Some of those questions you had to go out, get some responses from partners. Cedar Rapids Police Department, I know, had commented on quite a few of those. So we've had the exhibit. I think that showed up in our for us on Thursday with the agenda. So we've hopefully had a time to review that. Pretty lengthy document, so I do appreciate the time and effort that was put into that, so that we could be prepared for this conversation tonight. I think at this point, what I'd like to do is turn it over to fellow board members and see if there's any of those questions that were addressed in that exhibit that we'd like to take a deeper dive on, and then turn it over to whoever it's going to be to respond to that. And then also just noting that Vice President Garlock did provide everybody with the full exhibit, so it's printed and should be available for you for reference.
So one of the things that I'd like to talk about and maybe get a little clarification on is the data. We have district data from SRO involvement in our schools. And then like a couple hours before our last meeting, the Cedar Rapids Police Department sent us additional data about service calls. And I need a little further explanation if anyone here can help me with this. In the information we were provided, it says that service calls are not calls for an SRO or for service of students during the school day. So then it goes on further to say that from the service calls, there's data that is also referred to as incident data. So am I understanding service calls, and then incident data is a subset of service calls? So what I'm not clear about is the incident data, does that or does that not involve our students? Is it an incident that police were called to the school because of a student situation? Or are these more community-based service calls that include a student? You understand my question?
Understand your question.
Okay.
and appreciate the question. So first, I want to stress that throughout the year, the data that we've looked at on a monthly basis is the charge, or otherwise known as arrest data, and it's also the SRO assistance data. So we've been very intentional about doing those metrics. Service calls, that came out, so CRPD, and they've worked with me on this, they measure what police officers are doing based on service calls to addresses. That can be a school address, that can be, a public address, that can be a grocery store, that can be a person's home or whatever. Service calls are any time they make a stop at that address, whether it's for a call, whether it's not for a call. I said, if there's alarms going off, if there's a traffic stop, if there's a loose dog in the neighborhood. So they can they can stop there and do a visit and do a check. The incident data they pulled from that was during the school day with students. But what is important to pay attention to is that it could have been a parent, it could have been a neighbor, it could have been school personnel, it could have been anybody during that time. It wasn't a call for an SRO, but at times, if there was always a report done if there was incident data. But that same data would be placed into the SRO assistance if an SRO assisted with it. And if there was a charge or arrest, it'd be in that data field too. So most of the incident data would be tracked in one of those data pieces that we're looking at as well if there was the arrest, the charge, or an SRO was involved. So there are a few circumstances where there was an incident data that they went, let's say a neighbor called and they saw a student walking outside during the school day for some reason and they didn't know what they were up to. That might have not used the SRO that day. That might not have been any type of charge or arrest, but that could have been an incident. So the data is correlated, but it's also separate where some of the stuff won't be measured and the numbers won't be exact. But I'm going to go back to, again, what we've been looking at this year. So I've asked the question, if incident data is something we need to look at in the future, that's something we need to look at on a monthly basis and talk about. If not, if we're still looking at the charge arrest data as one piece and the SRO assistance, those are the two pieces of data we're going to stick with and monitor closely.
Okay.
So, and if the board has an opinion on whether we should include in the future that incident data, I think that would be a good thing to identify or not, because that until the last board meeting where this came and you got the email a little bit before, that was the first time I had heard of incident data as well.
Okay, yeah, that was my question. I didn't quite understand how that incident data actually correlated to what was happening in our schools. And it sounds to me that incident data is a much more broad category of incidents.
And
Okay.
service calls even bigger than that. So
Yeah.
service calls, incident data, SRO assistance with the charges and arrests inside.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that was made very clear in the information we got from CRPD shortly before that last meeting.
I'm sorry. Another question is, have we talked to our principals in our district regarding SROs in the building? And I'm looking at the explanation, but I don't feel that it was answered. I mean, are they for it or not? That's kind of,
It's a great question.
okay.
So our high school principals are supportive of having SROs in our high schools at this time. I think I can speak freely and say that they're supportive of that, in addition to Metro as our alternative high school programming. Middle schools were supportive of the changes we've made this past year and how that's worked, and have continued to be supportive of the function of not having one in their current buildings, not saying they wouldn't if we said, hey, we're putting them in, or they're gonna take on a different measure or be housed somewhere. That is not me telling you they would not work with us on that, but they were supportive also of removing them from the two buildings we removed them from and putting in place instead engagement specialists and having the floater process. Nobody has complained that that has not worked or they didn't have access to CRPD like they should.
You mentioned engagement specialists, and just to make sure that we all understand that and that role, can you give us just a brief rundown of what that position entails?
So there's a lot of roles that they do. So if there's engagement specialists listening, I don't want to go into, like, this isn't all they do, but really their primary responsibility is to engage with our students and to engage with our families. And that engagement can be attendance. Maybe they're missing a lot of school and they're making those calls. Maybe there's some behaviors, any type of thing to make those connections and work with students and families that need that additional support. But they do a lot with attendance, they do a lot with assistance with behaviors, and really they're working to engage people within our system in a positive fashion. They can also do so academically and help students throughout the day and connect with parents and families on making sure students are doing well successfully on their grades.
Do they have any particular background or training?
It's a great question. Yes, we do provide some training for them. We're expanding that for next year. We have extremely well qualified, some of them have social worker degrees, some of them have psychology degrees, some of them have teaching degrees. I mean, there's just a wide array of people who fulfill those roles. And some of them just have lived experience in our system and connections with those families. So all of them have a lot of wealth of information that they're assisting us with, and I believe we can become even stronger on that as we work with them on what other supports do you guys need and what trainings to help you be better within your positions.
Are they full-time within the schools?
They are full. The majority of them are all full-time. There are a few that are not full-time, but the majority all are full-time. And of course, the larger the building, usually more engagement specialists if you're a high school than an elementary, of course.
There's some information here about security, campus security positions at our high schools as well. Is that something that could be expanded in replace of an SRO program? And would the funds, being freed up? High schools are pretty big buildings, and I don't know what coverage do we have for those security positions right now, and what could we have?
So I think that's a great question. We do have security positions. We just recently filled a few others. We've had some that do stay open, like some of the other positions. Their pay schedule aligns with our para-educators. So they're very cost effective. I mean, we're talking starting $15.50 up to, approximately $20 an hour. They can be hard to find. They do a fabulous job. The people that we have in our current roles and positions, we have a few that serve middle schools that do a fabulous job, as well as high schools. I believe our schools are completely supportive of that structure as well. There would be absolutely an opportunity to expand on that. Like I said, at times are hard to fill, so I'm going to make sure I'm stressing that as well, but that is an option potentially as well for the future. We have also, in the past, outsourced some additional support at the rate of $20 an hour, and that was 2 years ago. So when we've needed some additional security individuals in place, we have worked with a firm in the past. We are not currently doing that because we have our own internal people in our SROs, but that was another thing we've done in the past.
Kind of following up on that, is there anything, there's a lot of different pieces that come together as potential replacements or supplements to the SRO programs, from mental health resources, engagement specialists, and now we're talking about security officers. Is there anything else to replace an SRO program that you would kind of envision us adding, or that we would do more of, or those type of things, kind of the extent of it?
So I think there's lots of options. There's BHIS workers. We've talked about some and talked about doing a pilot program with how people respond really to students that have behaviors, but it's not really a mental health need within our system. So we've talked a lot with Teenager about, just because kids are misbehaving doesn't automatically mean it's a mental health issue. So sometimes it would require more of a BHIS worker to support what are those behaviors, what are the strategies we could give our adults within our system to support that. We've also talked somewhat about social workers, but I also do want to stress, I think there's a different mindset of like mental health here, safety and security. Do I feel safe within the building? And I think that's a lot of the questions and the feedback you've probably been receiving, as well as myself, into, is it more of those security type positions then? But how are we defining what safety and security looks like in our building? Is it mental health? Because that's a different component than I feel safe in my space, that I'm afraid somebody's going to come in and take me. Bad example maybe, but you understand what I'm saying. Nobody's going to take me, but they'd bring me back.
You might want to say what BHIS is.
Okay.
For
BHIS
folks that are
workers, so I'm
listening.
going to get that. I got it marked here. Behavioral health,
Yeah.
yes.
Intervention services.
Intervention services, thank you. Behavioral health intervention services. So again, I'm going to stress, it's a student, like right now, they get tracked to mental health supports. Sometimes it's not mental health, but that's what we have. So we've really talked with Tanager about is that, or that layer below, and could we pilot some programs this year with those BHIS workers and talk about just behaviors and what supports and strategies we could utilize to help support students. Relaxation rooms is another one. Is there, relaxation rooms where we can have staff support, de-escalate students, de-escalation training, restorative practices.
There's quite a bit of optimism that a lot of our partners could step up their efforts if we ask them to going into this school year. Would you say that's correct? Do you think if we didn't go forward with an SRO program, we'd be in position to get a lot of these things in place and bring them up to another level?
We have amazing community partners, and anytime I ask for help or I call or I say, hey, what types of supports, they're always willing to be open, honest, transparent, and talk about what that looks like. There hasn't been anybody that said they're not open to expanding services and supports. There's also the realization that, we can't add 21 mental health therapists to what we currently have, but we can incrementally add a few at a time. But everybody said yes, they believe they could expand services and supports with our system at various locations.
And kind of following up again, we mentioned, the difficulty sometimes in filling security positions. And so we've got the funding from the SRO program, whatever we do with that. But we also talked at the last meeting about ESSER funding, I believe, kind of being there to supplement and build up a lot of these things. Would that be a way to potentially get more security in the building with higher salaries if that's what it took?
I definitely think there's always an opportunity to currently use ESSER funds for the next 2 years and then create sustainability plans for what are the focus areas for the future and where are we going to put our money. Because after ESSER goes away, this would all be dropout at risk and we're going to have to prioritize. But for the next 2 years, I definitely think there's things that we can add and then prioritize the work and see where our goals and results are being met for after that.
This is Superintendent Bush. Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Quaker. Just to be clear, the only thing around safety and security that ESSER funds could pay for are more facility related or safety mitigation related. It would not be for personnel, nor could it pay for an SRO program. It can only pay for the safety and security in regards to pandemic related issues. So that would not be something, mental health, yes, can be paid for out of ESSER, but not safety and security.
Thank you, Superintendent Bush. Great clarification point.
I'm curious, when we talk about beefing up security, how is that better than an SRO program? How is that an option that is somehow, because they're not wearing police uniforms?
I'm not sitting here saying it's better. When we talked about cost-effective type measures, I'm definitely not saying that's better. I think whether we have security people involved or whether we have SROs, we continue to have to work on what are restorative practices that we have in place, how are we responding to students, how are we teaching about behaviors, how are we shifting from being punitive, and again, great celebrations this year. Our arrest rates our charge rates have gone way down, right? So that was one of the main goals, that we weren't placing students into our criminal system. I will say, our security individuals that work in our buildings, they come in common dress, they assist with things, they do a great job. They're forming relationships as well, just like our SROs are forming relationships, connecting with kids. That's one of the goals. But it does look and feel different, I believe, to the students in the system, but I'm not telling you guys that one way is better than another. I'm just saying that they're different ways.
So I just want to build on that. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not in the room, so I can't really read the room. So I'm not sure if I'm stepping on somebody else that's trying to talk. So I just wanted to jump in and just kind of build on that relationship building aspect. The SROs, the 2 floater SROs that were responsible for elementary and middle school had commented that the really important part of their job is the individual relationships they have with students. Between elementary and middle schools, we have an enrollment of close to 9,000 students. So divided by 2 floater SROs, that's 4,500 students each. knowing that you can't really have a meaningful relationship with 4,500 people, I'm wondering how the students are identified and connect with the SROs, where the SROs are kind of building those relationships. How are those students selected?
So currently with the floater structure, I would have to say that the way they would form relationships would be by their interactions when we call for SRO assistance, or they're connecting with a family or a parent because of, again, a situation that we've said, hey, can you go over to this building and have some conversations? We're not identifying families or students and saying, hey, can you connect with these families and students and form relationships? And typically they do stop in buildings when there's not calls, but there's not like a regular rotation that they're doing. So it would really be when they're interacting with a situation that we've asked for their expertise on or their assistance with.
I see. So it's not a student that's maybe been identified through an office referral necessarily. It could just be an intervention. I'm just really trying to get super clear that this is not a disciplinary structure, and that is not how the goal is defined of this program. And I just want to be really clear that this is not a disciplinary structure. Correct.
That is correct. They would not view the role of discipline. Just to be clear, so I just want to kind of clarify like the three lanes here. Administration, they're in charge of discipline. Mental health is in charge of social emotional supports and mental health. Safety and security would be the lane of certainly the SROs, but also the way in which they do that is creating relationships with students who then feel more secure within the relationship to either provide information or they have questions or this happened in my neighborhood last night. That's the nature of the relationship, not necessarily like a social, emotional, mental health support, but rather you are a resource in my community. You are a police officer whom I know, and therefore I get a better familiarity of what your role is in the community, but also how you can help me feel safe at school. So those would be the three lanes in which I would want to make sure that's clear, that perhaps hasn't been clear in our prior conversations. But no, the role of the disciplinarian is the administration.
Thank you for that clarification. So as far as safety and security services that are being provided by SROs, are any of those services, without an SRO assigned to our district, would that be a service that would be then unavailable to students or staff?
So I think that goes back to the 911 calls, which I'm still going to stress. If there's an emergency, we call 911, like everybody would, right? Quick assistance. If something's happening, we call 911. We also have a non-emergency number, and I gave an example of when we at times use that. Now, typically, a lot of times we aren't using that because if it's, well, it depends. If it's during the school day, I will make a call and call Lieutenant Welsh or Lieutenant McGarvey and ask for an SRO instead of calling the non-emergency number. If it's outside of school hours and we need something, I will typically still call them, but we would have at times the non-emergency number as well. So if somebody, I said, goes in through a window at Roosevelt, I use, which happened, no destruction, like somebody goes in and we need somebody to check into that, that can be on the weekend a non-emergency number, and CRPD responds and assists us. Just like if we call for an SRO, it's just we're identifying those people, training those people, and have closer relationships with those individuals because we work with them on a regular basis.
Thank you.
I am thinking about the comparison between, we've heard a lot about building relationships, that the SROs spend a good deal of their time building relationships. And I think we all know that building relationships with kids is critical. I think we would all be in agreement with that. So my question, or sort of the thing that I'm pondering is, and I know this is very subjective, but we have SROs building relationships with kids. We also have our security folks. Do we have a sense that they're building relationships in much the same way that an SRO is building relationships? I mean, are they comparable in that aspect of their role?
I would say definitely. I mean, they're still working with kids in the building, right? So
Yeah.
I don't want to say there's not different roles, but forming relationships, if you're connecting with kids, you can be the secretary forming relationships with kids in the same way. So yes, I believe everybody in our system does a fabulous job, and everybody's number one priority is connecting with kids and forming those relationships and getting to know students. So the one that I know that's walking around the building in the halls, I mean, kids that are out of class the most, that's the person they connect to, right? Forming a relationship, get them back to class. So I definitely think all of our people within our system are doing that. And lunch duties, before and after school, our SROs do that stuff, our security people do that stuff, our admin do that stuff. I mean, we have a lot of people in our system working really hard to form relationships and make sure that our system is safe and secure.
Yeah, and I'm sort of wondering if those relationships are formed more because of accessibility. If there's an adult that's accessible to the student, they're going to form that relationship. And if it's an adult that they see frequently in the hallway, and that adult has time to stop and chat, that's how the relationship is formed. So it's like, as we think about supporting our students, are we making sure that our students have an adult that is readily accessible? I mean, I know kids have their teacher, their classroom teacher, but there are also 30 kids in that class. So it's like, can we make that effort to make sure there are easily accessible adults that are not busy supervising the cafeteria or filling in for a teacher that's sick, that's their job, to be available and help kids. So just what I'm pondering.
I do have a question. When we go back to the why, when we started looking at SROs, and we had a presentation from the Black Student Union at Kennedy High School with their concerns about not feeling safe or uncomfortable. I guess my question is, and the panorama that was administered, and we know that the numbers weren't what we wanted it to be, but I felt that in some ways the point was missed, and we didn't address what the Black Student Union, what our brown and black students had a concern about. And like we say, we want all of our students to feel safe within our schools. So I think it's so important as we're working through this, we need to hear their voices. And I'm hoping that time is taken to meet with each one of these BSU's groups to find out their concerns, to come up with a solution. Because like I said, we want everyone to feel safe. And right now, we have some of our students that do not feel safe in the school. And we want that to be a positive experience. And there was, to tie that in, there was a question, can we have reps from all BSU speak to us about their perspective, since the students brought this issue to us in the first place? And the response was, if the board is interested in this, I think as a board, we are interested. We have to get the feedback from all of our students, so I would encourage that. I believe that some of our students are feeling their voices have not been heard, and we really need to address that concern too.
I appreciate that. In talking to some of our students as well, they said it's really hard to continue to fight the battle and say the same message when they feel like things aren't shifting or changing the way they want it to. And as you acknowledged, there are students that don't feel safe, and we can see that in the data.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other people saying, well, there's a lot that do because of it. Yes, there are. There's definitely, this is a polarizing issue. Our goal is to make sure all students feel safe, right? And make sure we put the best programs in place to support all of our students in whatever that looks like. So I think we have to remember that. And I've been trying to really reflect on how hard it is as a student to get, how hard it is as an adult to get in front of people and talk about points, but then as a student for something you're really passionate about and you've been fighting for and you don't feel progress. So as we move through this, student voice has to be our most important thing, and you brought that up. President Humbles at the last, not President Humbles anymore, Director Humbles at the last meeting, and I do think moving forward, the more we can get their voice, but also remembering and acknowledging that that's just, some of it relives their trauma they've experienced, they've even said. So coming and saying this over and over, or even doing it the first time, they're reliving their experiences that aren't positive.
One,
I have a question about, I'm just kind of looking at cost and thinking about how we can provide the most services in the most cost-effective way to the most students that need it. So looking at mental health supports and having had feedback from staff members where they would like to have more bodies in buildings to just help with general classroom management, hallway management. I'm looking at the SRO cost of $70,000, and then the therapist cost of $15,000, the BHIS at $5,000, the restorative practitioner at $30,000, hall monitor at $30,000, engagement specialist at $45,000. So I'm wondering, is there in place currently some kind of determination of what school would do best with what kind of additional support? So let's say that we have that $70,000, we're going to spend it different. Therapist, BHIS, restorative, whatever. What criteria is there currently to decide what additional support would go into what building?
So in talking, what we did last year is we worked with those administrators who I know worked with their teams in their building and asking and talking through what would be something that would assist us as a, and when I say a replacement strategy, it doesn't mean it's replacing exactly the same thing, but what additional supports, like you said, are we needing that can best help supplement the needs of the system? So we would really rely on our buildings. The thing that we'd have to do is come up with some choices and options. So last year we also discussed like social workers. We don't have any, we have social workers that serve our system through the AEA, but we don't employ and have a job description for a social worker and haven't managed that type of structure. So some of those things I think is, as we talk through what supports are needed, if we can expand like BHIS, that behavior health intervention services, this next year would be a trial year and a pilot year. We don't have those supports either, but in listening to community partners and some of the needs of our administrators in our buildings and what we're hearing, and from staff as well, that could be something as well that could help supplement and assist our adults within buildings.
So is there current data that's been identified by buildings as to what additional resources they would like to see in place?
We have not asked each one separately what they would want as replacement. We have talked about, everybody wants more, right? More people to help serve students in different ways. We have a lot of different supports. We've expanded greatly. We've expanded even some engagement specialists in buildings. We've added different supports based on needs. So I think it's all about having those conversations, looking at data, helping that drive the decisions, and then looking at our strategic plan and our priorities and how we're gonna best get to our outcomes.
Right, so I just want to be super clear. I think that it's great that would be something that would be building driven, but I also want to be super clear that I think that this is an additional resource that needs to be provided not by existing teachers. I don't think we can give our staff, our established staff, additional work. I don't think that serves kids better. I don't think it delivers better educational opportunities for our students, and I don't think it honors our staff as education professionals.
Director Borcherding, this is Superintendent Bush. Just a concrete example of maybe to help specify or clarify your question. I'll just go to one of our comprehensive high schools implemented a program a few years ago that was specifically addressing I would say certainly safety measures and what we would call HRS or high reliability schools level 1 safe, supportive, collaborative environments. And they implemented a system where students, if they were not in class on time, that they were doing on a rotation basis hallway sweeps is what they call it, to make sure that it wasn't a punitive system, but rather a data collection system, but also to find out why students weren't coming to class on time and to find out if they needed something. And so in order to manage that system, they did need different kind of staff, and so they were having a challenging time hiring the what were former security positions. So they changed those positions, and I would say they were more like engagement specialist positions that really were tracking the data and engaging with students. So that would be a specific example of a school using their HRS data, their attendance data, their student academic data to implement a research-based system, therefore finding the personnel in order to implement a system of support. So I just want to say that that's the purpose of HRS, is district level common language, but it is a school-based plan. But very true what you say, we do need equity across our system in regards to the types of resources that are provided. So that just gives you an example of how a school might make a school-based decision to implement resources that might be a little different than another school.
Director Newman, did you have a question?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think that we do have things to celebrate in the progress that has been made, and I'm grateful to CRPD to being open to those changes in the past year and working hard to make those changes. Do we have conversations with and do we validate some of these changes with our Black student unions to be sure that they know and see that these changes are being made, and do they feel them in the schools? So does that happen? Are we having conversations and saying, are you seeing this too, or are you seeing and experiencing something entirely different?
There are conversations that happen, and it depends who you ask and which ones you ask, what their feedback's gonna be. So have some people felt like there's changes? Yes. Have others felt like there's not? Absolutely. It depends what people's goals are, right? Just like adults, of what they feel like needs to happen in the long run in order for schools to be safe and secure. And you have people on one side and you have people on the other side, including students. So yes, some have definitely acknowledged and said, yes, we see differences, and others haven't seen differences. And it depends also on your interactions, right? If I have interactions with an SRO or a police officer, I don't. And I think that connects to also the feeling of when you come into the school, what your viewpoints are on having a police officer in your school. What were my prior interactions in life, and what maybe I haven't had any.
May I ask a follow-up? We say that we want every student to feel safe in schools. Realistically, what does that look like? Because you can take SROs out and you might have a significant part of the population that suddenly feels unsafe. What does it look like for students to feel safe?
It's a great question I've pondered and spent a whole lot of time on. A lot of time, I'm sure we all have, right? And I look at it as an educational leader, we're gonna do everything we can, that whole sense of belonging and our panorama data of how do we feel like in our space. And belonging for me might mean something different than for you and something different than you. But how do we get it where all of our staff, or as many as possible, feel like they're coming to a safe space where they're valued, they're supported, and I think there's so many components in that, but our job is to continue to work and listen, especially to student voices, also to our staff voices, also to our family voices. What does this big picture look like in the end? How do we achieve the best goal we can, with a goal of every single person saying, I love where I go every day. I love the Cedar Rapids school system. I feel safe. I feel like I belong. And I'm going to get a great education, or I'm going to provide a great education, and I'm going to connect with kids, and we're going to connect with adults if we're children or students in the system. And I think as long as we're working towards that goal, there's going to be bumps along the road, and there's no magical answer. I've asked that question to districts that have SROs and districts that don't have SROs, and it's all about what are our views, how do we define safety and security, and what supports do our buildings need, and where do we believe our resources should be driven. Which is why we.
And then building on that safety conversation, I guess, you know, I love data. I love empirical, objective data. Anecdotal data, not so much. I'm kind of spent some time actually the past year reviewing a lot of different evidence-based data, and I am hoping that someone can help me understand how SROs increase the safety of schools based by empirical, objective, gathered data through a scientific method.
So I'd say if you've been in a school when a fight breaks out, which I have been, the SRO definitely can impact how that goes and how people feel safe. But I would say that experiences differ across, sure, anecdotally, but also I think that we can find whatever information we want on the internet, and I think that a lot of information that's been provided to us has been very cherry-picked, frankly.
So defining safety, I do think that there has to be clarity here. Again, I go back to those three roles of the administrator, mental health, social emotional supports, and then safety security. And so making sure that we're clear about what we mean about all aspects of safety. So the sense of belonging that Deputy Superintendent Quaker is referring to is absolutely social emotional, but also you can feel a sense of belonging by knowing when you walk into a space and a place that you do not have to worry about the physical security of the location. So I am and have been a high school administrator. Obviously, I've been a student as well, like others. I don't know who else has maybe ever, unfortunately, been involved in violent acts, but I have been. I have, as a child, been actually in a school shooting that happened in my school. And I will tell you, the adults were very, very responded as best as they could, but relieved to see police officers' support in that situation. No, it wasn't a school with an SRO. I've also been a teacher who had to break up a fight when a student stabbed another student with no police support. And it was very challenging until police got there to help that support. I've had to break up large high school fights with other school administrators. And this is no blame. This is no means that these were unsafe schools. These were all very safe schools in regards to their typical data. But adolescents living in our society, it's unpredictable. So the role of a police officer is not the same as a mental health support. So those would be the things that our district has to decide when we talk about the role of an SRO. What is the clarity? What do we want that role to be if as the program is considered moving forward? So I would just offer those personal experiences that it's very challenging as an adult to help high school kids who are in crisis, especially when it's a violent act.
I'd like to just ask, our nearest district of comparable size is Iowa City, and they don't have SROs at all and never have, correct?
That is accurate.
And is there any reason to not draw the comparison between our two districts? Is there anything so different about the two districts that we couldn't really learn a lot from their experience? Because it doesn't seem to be chaos down there without SROs, but maybe there's something different.
So we've had quite a few conversations with them. I definitely think they're comparable in size, somewhat in demographics. I think you can also argue the other side of this, that Cedar Rapids is in Iowa City. So again, I think it depends where you're coming from. Can we learn and listen and talk to them? Absolutely 100%. They're, I don't know, 20 miles down the road, 30 miles, and I think continued conversations for sure are a must. And I asked, is there any plans in the future, right? For them, there's not. Des Moines had them, and now they don't have them, and they've had conversations of what things look like, what additional support. So everybody, I think, looks at this differently. You can also bring up schools that do. I've been at systems that have SROs. I've been at systems that don't. Small, middle-sized, large. It's all about the priorities, and I think Superintendent Bush said it. How are we defining what we want and what supports in our system we want to focus on, and then moving forward with that and putting a plan in place of what that looks like.
So I think that there are many layers to this, as we all recognize and know. one thing I can appreciate is personal experiences. I feel like we have gotten so far away from the main thing. And this is to blame absolutely no one. This is not saying that your perspective is wrong or your perspective is wrong. That is not what I'm saying. I actually respect people's opinions about this because I feel that you have gathered information and that has built your perspective, and I think that's great. But I will tell you from experience, we can't compare Cedar Rapids to Iowa City because we're Cedar Rapids. We're not Iowa City. And the things that I have experienced in the schools, I was glad that the SRO was there. Now, do we want to look at some, really clarifying the serve and protect piece of it? Let's look at that. Not being in the schools, treating kids like adults on the street. Let's look at that. The public schools are public buildings, and anybody can come in. I have experienced just being in the hallway during passing time, and someone, kids get on phones, they make phone calls, these brawls break out, and people come to assist them. And I have experienced a weapon falling off of a person that was not a student right next to me. So was I happy that an SRO was there? Absolutely. So my thing is, there's not a question in my mind as to whether they should be there or not. I want them there. But maybe if we can look at some type of reform and clarity about what it looks like to have them in the environment where students are, instead of dealing with some of the kids like criminals on the street. If you have not been in that position where you have been there and have experienced different things, I get that you would feel differently about it. I completely get it. But knowing what I know and I've seen what I've seen, there's definitely a need. Now, maybe, like I said before, is look at how these things are, and another thing I will say is I heard Superintendent Bush say that the administrators are the disciplinarians. In my experience, I've been through 2 SROs. They work very well with the admin team. The admin team kind of directs them as to which way to go with it and what they want to see done. So there's more to it than just what we see. And I'm a huge advocate for getting to the root of these issues. If arrest numbers are too high, let's get to the root of the issue. What other supports and resources can we offer these kids as to why these things are happening? A lot of it, I've said before, it's beef that happens in the street and then it follows over into the school building. A lot of this stuff does not happen in the school day. You threw an apple at me, so now I'm going to just beat you up. No, it doesn't work like that. And it starts even on the middle school level, and it kind of just rolls over into high school, especially freshman year, because a lot of this happens over the summer, and things, get really greasy, and then all of a sudden we got a mess on our hands when school starts. So that's what I would like to see happen. For me, it's not a question whether we need them there. I'm absolutely for it. But I want to see some type of, let's visit what that looks like for them to be there so that they are serving and protecting our kids. I've seen them build the relationships and all that, and people on the outside looking in that are completely against it, I get it. But that's it, on the outside looking in. From the inside looking out, there's a need. So I want to look at different options that will be helpful to these children and not just treat the behavior, but offer, and more than just behavioral therapists, I think we can be really creative with how we really support them and offer resources for the root of the problem, the root of these issues, and not just treat the crime.
I appreciate the comments, and as I know, like a lot of us have spent time inside schools, but as somebody that's spent time very recently inside schools, your perspective is really powerful. So even at the last school board meeting when you spoke about some real experiences that you've had, I hear them loud and clear. So I appreciate your perspective. And I do agree. I think that there's, I think that we're looking at, a full team. Like, what role does the SRO play? What role do these other folks play that we could bring in? And how do we lead in Cedar Rapids? How do we create something that is what we need in Cedar Rapids? And so I think there's an opportunity for us to do more. And I know I feel like I've been hearing for a while that it's not an or, it's an and, right? I mean, there's an opportunity for us to expand in some of these services and support kids in new and better ways. So appreciate the perspective.
Well, and I think it's important, like you said, we have to expand, because I think our focus has just been on SROs. It's broader. It's more broader to me than the SROs, because our children are in need of some assistance too. And like Director Roundtree said, she's been there. She's experienced the high school, and I'm sure that you've been, I think, in the middle school. But I think our whole focus has just been SROs. Yeah. It's more to me than that. We've got to look at what can we do in a time right now that our kids are safe. What type of support do we need to be providing beyond behavior therapists? And I like when Director Garlick said, mentors. Some of our children are in need of folks that are mentoring them. But it's just, and this is a tough decision that will happen, and not saying, but I want us to look beyond. I think we're just focused on SROs. Let's look at what we right now as a board can do to impact the lives of our children. And that is my concern right now.
May I add to that? I think another very real concern is that once this is voted on, the rest of the details go away. And I think that is the concern. I made a comment before that if children of color if that's the highest numbers of arrests and charges, let's wrap our arms around that piece in itself. I want to see therapists and people that look like them to help them. There are some kids who are not going to sit down with a therapist, especially if they feel like they cannot connect with who's before them. It is going to be an automatic shutdown because they're going to feel judged. So how serious are we really about helping the students of color? If this is where the complaint lies, there's students of color who have the higher numbers of the arrest rates and all that. What does that look like? Because once the vote is done, what are we going to do? And I think that's something that I can speak for me. I don't want to vote on this and however it ends up, and the rest of it goes away. Because we're still dealing with the same stuff. There's a group called Unsnapping. I believe that's the name of it. And they deal with young black men to try and help them change their perspective to be more productive in our community. And those are the type of resources that I desire to see.
Well, and could I follow up with that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And I think it's important, too, that as a community, that we come together and look at the big picture, bringing in folks that can work us through this process so we're all on the same page. And like you said, we could have a vote, it's done. but what do we follow up with? And I think that's when we get our community involved, the folks that are working within our schools, and we come together and say, how do we make it better for all? And I think that's really key right now.
It is.
So we can't just vote and we're done, and then next year we come back and we're still in the same place again. It is time for everyone to get involved with this beyond SROs and say what is best for our students, our families, this community, because we all want our students to thrive and to be successful. So it can't end with a vote and then we're done. That's when we need to draw in other folks to say, we need to, and it takes a village to bring us all together and see how we move forward.
So basically not to look at the SRO thing as just the big elephant in the room, but joining hands as a community, including this entity as well, saying how can we better serve our families? How can we better serve our students? Yes, absolutely.
I greatly appreciate all those comments so much, because what you're talking about is what we believe in, and that community support, and not, schools cannot do this work alone. And I think that what Director Roundtree and Director Humbles have highlighted here is this is much bigger than an SRO conversation. And what you're talking about is and systems, not or systems. And I just greatly appreciate those comments of and. How can we add supports to our kids? The NAACP Snapping program is a great example, and that entity is always so willing to help us. And so giving specific measures and specific things and specific asks, I think will also greatly help us. So this conversation, I think, has given us the specific asks too, that we can look to those entities for some specifics and how we can get help.
I think that one thing we are hearing here is, well, two things we are hearing. This is going to take time and commitment, and I think you're hearing a commitment from the board, or that this is a priority of our board, that we don't just vote and whatever happens, that's the end of it, which I don't think is the district's intention, or CRPD's for that matter. But I do think that we have an opportunity to really pull in some of the greatest minds in our community from all corners. And, I hope that the board can somehow also be involved in that conversation. It's going to take time to figure it out, but we need to pull in people from all over. Even just a conversation with Emily Bloom about what it would take to get more mental health professionals. And she said, well, define that, because they're hard to hire.
They are.
So it even comes back to how do we identify, and how do we identify within communities and train more people and involve more people. It's complicated, but we can do hard things. So
Absolutely appreciate that.
I'd just like to make a recommendation, if we're going to have a larger discussion on this, is maybe we can start by kind of getting a picture of the community and just who is in our community. Someone who attended Cedar Rapids schools 30 years ago, the demographic profile of the community and the district has changed since then. You see charts, students of color versus white students in the district. It's changed just in the last 10 years, but definitely a lot over the longer period of time. And so we could look at census data that was released last year. They also have the American, I believe it's the community survey, that's a yearly thing that the census data puts out. You could compare it to our surrounding districts, just to get a sense of who's in our community, who's in our student population, and that might help us kind of frame the issue for the larger community who might not have any idea. They just see what they see on the news. And if we kind of ground it in the facts of who's in our community, what are the conditions that they're living in, that would be a good place to start from to build up that larger and kind of contextualize that entire conversation, I think. Just a suggestion.
I just want to say thank you to the administration primarily for allowing us to ask all the questions that we've asked and for the time and energy you've all put into getting the answers for us. I think when we tabled the SRO vote at our last meeting, I think for most of us, no matter where we stand on the SRO issue, we felt like we just needed more information about other supports that we could provide for our students. So I'm glad that we had this opportunity to sit and talk about what we think is important for kids. So I appreciate the work you guys have done.
And I appreciate that the board has come up with the questions and been willing to have these hard conversations to figure out what's best. And no matter where you lie, we're working together to do what's best for our system and our students.
I also appreciate the work of the administration that have been responsive to answering questions. I would like to make sure that we are aware as a board, and I know that I will be taking into consideration the history of this program, and that it has been identified that it was located in the middle schools that had permanent placements due to race. At the beginning of this program, the SROs were placed in the middle schools that they were placed in based on race.
I didn't understand what she just said, because she was,
I think she said that the reason they were placed where they were placed in the middle schools was based on race.
Just following up on that, because that's something we talked about last year, and there's probably people in the audience right now who were very vociferous saying that was not cool, and I appreciate the community's input on that, and I agree. Following up, I guess this is before we go, we talk about the 2 floater positions, because the floater positions ended up at Washington and Jefferson last year. Looking at our family survey data, I don't know, are our high schools similar in population size, or are there?
Kennedy is the largest, and
Okay.
then Jefferson and Wash are
Okay,
smaller
so
than
maybe, because there's about twice as many responses from Kennedy families, I assume they had a little bit bigger of a population. I don't know if it's twice as big.
It's
but-
not twice as large, but is a larger
Okay.
population.
But either way, I'm pretty sure that Washington and Jefferson have our highest number of students of color. And so the problem with the middle schools just ended up being repeated with the floater positions at the high schools. And it just seems to go against what we talked about the first time through last summer to allow that to happen. And now the request from CRPD is to put an officer back at McKinley. And that's just going backwards in my view. And so, and what I'm wondering is, if those floater positions are out there floating around, where are they going to float to? Where are they going to end up? And are we going to take steps to stop that? I mean, do we need the floater positions? Is there a solid opinion or recommendation on that?
I had appreciated the like in the questions, like the day in the life of an SRO, because it actually addressed some of that, because I knew that we had some concerns about we didn't ask for two SROs in a school. We asked for 2 floaters. So to actually get some clarity on why there were 2 at certain schools, and I thought, I'm just looking at it, I think it's getting old, need readers. 34 was the question that I thought did a decent job of explaining that, and some other things, because I felt like when we were asking questions about the day in the life, it really wasn't super clear to us, and that I think was a concern. So I appreciate whoever asked that question and put that out there for us to see. And then I do also think that what I felt like I saw on the floaters is that there would be, and I think this came from the letter on the recommendation of having them as a home base, but not as a McKinley SRO or a Wilson SRO, or certainly not as a Roosevelt SRO, but as middle school SROs. So I think that there was some, but I think maybe we could get some further clarification.
Then why not start them at Taft and Harding every day?
What's that?
Then why not start them at Taft and Harding every day and work out from there? Why start at McKinley?
Because the incidents were the highest in those places based on that data that was provided to us. So I don't know if that data, I have no reason to believe the data that was provided in that letter is inaccurate, but I saw that the incidents were higher in 2 of the schools, and it seemed to be significantly higher in those 2 schools. But again, like to your point, we could have them start anywhere. But I think the point is that they're middle school SROs, not specific building SROs. I think that's what we were signaling, what we were hearing. We are not for that. We saw as Director Borchningen mentioned, the original introduction of SROs in Cedar Rapids were the most diverse schools in our community, and that's something that we definitely don't want to go back to. So going back to that is certainly not a place
I'm just
ever
afraid if
advocate for.
they're floating out there, I spend a lot of time in many neighborhoods in the community. I know the neighborhoods that I see cops drive through the most, where our SROs going to end up at the most. We know where they ended up last year. They ended up at Washington and Jefferson, justified or not. Director Roundtree was talking about the inside experience. This issue came to us from our black student unions. It's not like they are outsiders. They're looking in, asking us not just to reconsider the program. I think they would say end the program completely. So if we're looking from that perspective, it seems like we are kind of just going around that and continuing along the path without considering that. And I think the floaters, specifically with how they were used, how they've been proposed to be used by CRPD, is just the wrong direction in my view.
Yeah, and I think as several people have mentioned, getting a larger community conversation is something that I think most of us are if not all, are very much in favor of. The thing that we tabled is a vote on the 2080 agreement, which is specific to the SROs. So we need to consider that, because that's going to come back in front of this board at our next meeting, and we'll need to vote on it. We need to have that larger community conversation so that we can determine some of these other voices that need to be heard. So the BSUs, by all means, has to be at that table. The city as our partner in this, the Cedar Rapids Police Department, absolutely. And there's quite a few other organizations that I think need to be part of that conversation, because I think that our goal is to prioritize the safety of our schools, right, and our community as a whole. And there's a way for us to work collaboratively to do that. And I am looking forward to being part of that conversation, because I definitely think this board should be there as well as the other organizations. So
I'm going to go back to Director Merschrock. His comments, we are moving backwards, because the SROs, when they're identified, and I know there were incidents at these schools, but the message that we're sending out is this is where our problems are at. I know we had the floaters, and they ended up at Jefferson and at Washington High School. I struggle with how we use the SROs within the middle schools. So that will be something that I'll need to sort out. But then I also struggle with, we got two contracts out here. We have the one that was presented before the school board, and then there was one that was passed to the city. So the question is, I know it might be for other school board members, when we come back on the 11th, what are we voting on?
So
And kind of just based on what Director Humboldt just said, I know that there's been a lot of talk about collaborative effort, collaborative process, and community voices. I have not felt that this has been very collaborative at all at this point, honestly. I feel that the school board has been, I think there's been overreach from some partners. And I think that, if we're going to partner together, we have to actually establish a collaborative atmosphere where we recognize each other as legitimate governing bodies that can handle our own business.
I want to talk about the contract. So the contract that would go to the board on Monday would be the same contract that went to the board before, that has the 7 SROs, the 2 floaters that aren't identified in buildings, knowing that you as a board can make adjustments to either go with the recommendation of how the city approved that, or go with no floaters, or go with whatever you choose to do, but that's how it would come to you, and you would need to make any type of amendment. But it would be the same contract you've seen previously.
Okay, so if at that point, the original one we had at our school board meeting, it's also possible if we want to amend it, that could happen too at a school board meeting.
Absolutely, then that's
Okay.
up to you guys as a board.
yeah, my
We
understanding
would
is
just note that at the board meeting
Okay,
of how you want, of what you wanted in the contract.
okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
in my understanding, just to reiterate, my understanding is that the city council had the same contract that we had the day before. They just gave City Manager Pomerantz the authority to negotiate to specify the location of those two SROs, which came through the letter that we had gotten just 2 hours before our meeting.
Right.
So
But that is not represented in the contract that we are considering next week.
That is correct. You would get the contract that came to you before. That did not place them in one of the middle schools.
Correct, and you could also give guardrails to management, that being Deputy Superintendent Quaker and myself, similar to what the city did, and said, this is what we would like for you to negotiate, this is the guardrails, this is what we want you to think, consider, and work with the city to make that happen. So you could also do that as a board.
any additional questions from the board? With no further business, we stand adjourned.
Please stay tuned. I don't know that we'll be able to finish